I'm making this video because the definition of contracts and the materials and the four elements that are given for contracts, I'm afraid, are just confusing the situation and making it more complicated than it really needs to be. Let's start with the definition of a contract. The definition of a contract is an agreement between two or more parties that can be enforced in court. Well, that's just a lot of unnecessary words. For example, an agreement is always going to be between two or more parties. A person is never going to have an agreement with themselves that they're going to take to court. You can't have an agreement with 0 people or with a negative number of people. So you can just take out the part that says between two or more parties. So then the definition of a contract is an agreement that can be enforced in court. Well, that's like saying it's not a contract until a judge says it's a contract. That's completely unhelpful in the real world. I suppose the definition is helpful in one way because it makes it clear that you can have more than 2 people in a contract. There is no limit to the number of people that can be parties to a contract. The elements to a contract are more helpful. They get into the details a little bit more, and that's good, but at the same time, it can make things more complicated than it needs to be. Start with agreement. All you need for an agreement is someone to suggest something and then someone to agree to it. It's offer and acceptance. Somebody comes up and offers to buy something for a specific price, and the other person agrees. That's all it takes, offer and acceptance. And that's common sense. Now, without making things complicated, I hope, I'm going to explain offer and acceptance a little bit. First of all, the acceptance must be of the offer just as stated. So if somebody walks up and says, I will buy your car from you for $10,000, and the other person says, I'll take the $10,000, but in addition, I would like 3 of your chickens. That is not acceptance. That is a counteroffer. So for example, if somebody walks up and says, I will sell you my car for $10,000, and the other person says, I will take your car for $10,000, but I also want you to throw in the fuzzy dice on the mirror for free, that is not an agreement, that is not acceptance, that is a counteroffer. So the offer and acceptance must be perfectly matched. Now, sometimes this is called a meeting of the minds, but strictly speaking, the minds don't have to be perfectly matched. What you need to do is imagine that there is another person standing there listening to the conversation. And if that other imaginary person listening to the conversation believes there's an agreement, reasonably believes there's an agreement, then there's an agreement. So you'll hear people talk about there must be an objectively serious offer and there must be an objectively serious acceptance. When a person is talking about there must be something objective, what they're talking about is, would an imaginary person standing there listening to the negotiations believe that it's true? Believe that there's a serious offer, believe that there's a serious acceptance. And this person, imaginary person, the objective person, has to be a reasonable person. Not just anybody, but a reasonable person. So what will happen sometimes is you'll have 2 people talking, negotiating, and they will reach an agreement because they've made an objectively serious offer. There's an objectively serious acceptance, and the acceptance is of the same offer. The 2 are matched. The offer and acceptance are matched. But in the minds of the people negotiating, there are assumptions that are not spoken. Here's an example. 2 people are talking about buying and selling a house. One person says, I'll buy the house from you for $100,000. And the other person says, sold. There you've got an agreement. One person's going to give up the house, the other person's going to give up $100,000. And then when the day comes to close on the deal, the person who's getting the house realizes that the seller has taken the curtains. They didn't talk about the curtains when they were negotiating the deal. The buyer just assumed that the curtains would come with the house. They still have an agreement. It's just that the curtains are an outstanding issue. Okay, let me give you one last example, then we'll move on. Let's say a person goes to a car dealership to buy a car. He goes to the salesman, he says, I'll pay $15,000 for this particular car, and the salesman says, sold. A person standing there listening to that conversation would think that there's an objectively serious offer and an objectively serious acceptance. The person, the imaginary reasonable person standing there, would think that they have an agreement, and they do have an agreement. But then when the buyer comes to pick up the car, the buyer realizes the car doesn't come with a warranty. Nobody talked about the warranty. The warranty is an outstanding issue. They still have an agreement for the sale of the car, but they have a dispute about the warranty. So they've got an agreement, offer and acceptance match, according to a person standing there listening to the conversation, but they don't really have a meeting of the minds because the seller assumed the car would come with a warranty, the buyer assumed the car would come with a warranty, and the seller assumed it would not. Okay, so the first thing you need for a contract is offer and acceptance. The offer and acceptance must match. The minds do not have to match. You do not have to have a perfect meeting of the minds, just matching offer and matching acceptance. Then the next thing you need, or the next element of a contract, is consideration, which is a fancy legal word for something of value. Each party to the contract must give up something of value, and each party to the contract must receive something of value. It can be anything that's valuable, but it has to be something for each side. If there's not something given up and received of value on each side, then it's not a contract. For example, a birthday present or a Christmas present. One person gets something of value, the other person gets nothing. That is not a contract, that's just a gift. Okay, so consideration is something of value. There's two things you need to do about consideration. One, a promise to pay money is consideration. It is something of value. So if a person goes to a bank and borrows a bunch of money and promises to pay it back, they have a contract with the bank. They get the money, obviously that's something of value, and the bank gets a promise to repay it. That is also something of value, so it's a valid contract with the bank. The other thing about consideration is it has to be something of value, but the swap in the contract does not have to be fair. One of the people in the contract might get the better bargain. In fact, the bargain may be grossly unfair, but it's still a contract. It's still enforceable. Okay, the next element is contractual capacity. And that's just talking about some people who, for whatever reason, should not be allowed to make contracts. Children are the best example. Anybody under 18 years of old generally is considered too young to be making a contract. They're just not emotionally mature enough or smart enough to do it. There are some adults who are also not able to form contracts because they're not mature enough or smart enough. They usually have special problems, mental or emotional problems. But generally the law puts limits on some people. For example, some people are not allowed to vote, some people are not allowed to drive, and those same people are typically not allowed to make contracts. So you don't expect a 4-year-old to be able to make a contract. Now, despite all that, sometimes contracts will be enforced against children, and that's a whole different topic. So now let's talk about legality, and this is just the simplest, most common sense thing in the world. The courts are not going to enforce a contract if it's a contract for a crime. For example, a contract for a hit on somebody is not going to be enforced. A contract from illegal gambling is not going to be enforced. A bribe, where if I go, for example, and offer a congressman $10,000 to vote a certain way on a piece of legislation, That's illegal. Congressmen aren't supposed to be paid to vote. Okay, and this is the last thing that needs to be talked about, and we're done with this video. Not every contract has to be in writing. Some contracts do, some don't. And so being in writing is not technically an element of a contract. But for those contracts that have to be in writing, if they're not in writing, they will not be enforced. That's all. Thank you for listening.